Hey, figured it out.
How you're doing? Nah, don't worry, man. Like I told you, I've done this a couple of times by now, and I've had all the technical issues you can think of. So don't
Sweet.
worry if that happens, man.
Awesome, man. Hey, well, thanks first and foremost for having me on. I'm excited to chat. Checked out a few of these, and I think you do a really good job. So I'm excited to kind of, go back and forth on some of this stuff and kind of see what you think as well.
Thanks to you, my man. That's where I wanted to start. Thank you for taking the time. I really do appreciate it. And for a little bit of context, here in Mexico, well, we don't usually have the first news in regards to research and how to apply it to our training. We live kind of sometimes in the shadows, dare I say. So
Sure.
for me, the opportunity to have conversations with people like yourself is truly a blessing, truly an honor. And man, do I learn a lot from this.
Oh, dude, that's awesome. No, it's I was listening to one with Dr. Helms regarding their
Oh,
recent paper on the energy surplus stuff, and he did he made a really good point about the accessibility of English-based text to different people who don't speak the language is obviously just it's a limitation of the way that science is delivered. So particularly when you're able to kind of translate some of the information, that's a really important aspect of the process. That yeah, thanks for doing that. It's a really important thing for those of us that don't speak other languages to be able to do that. So that, along with your just expert, critique of the information in general, but being able to spread it to other people as well is a huge positive.
my pleasure, man. My pleasure. I can assure you that. So this particular, well, just to dig at the topic at hand,
For sure.
this research I found really interesting, and as you already talked about in several podcasts and several posts and so on and so forth. I think it's super interesting because we can apply it the wrong way. We can understand it the wrong way because it kind of lends itself into it, even if you are super clear on how you write it, because, well, we humans are tend to be like that, you know? Because, well, I had the conversations about proximity to failure a while back. I think it was last year or this year. I don't really recall, with Martin Ruffalo. And we can think that his meta-analysis and your meta-regressions are kind of in conflict, but not really, because we're talking about different beasts. And that's where I wanted to begin with. What did you do, and what is, well, for the people listening, what is the difference between a meta-analysis and what you did, which is a series, several meta-regressions? Is it okay if we begin by that?
So the first thing I'm going to say here is there is people mowing the grass right now. So the
Don't
absolute
worry, man.
so if that gets to the point where it's extremely distracting, let me know and I can move to a different room. But yeah,
Sure,
no,
man.
that's a great question, right? There's been multiple meta-analyses that have been done on the topic of proximity to failure, and kind of understanding the difference in the approaches is the first key to kind of understanding the way to actually apply the results, right? So the way that a typical meta-analysis is done is when you have two conditions, and you're basically taking the difference between the two conditions and ultimately pooling that across studies. So it's a study of studies. In the case of proximity to failure, the way it's traditionally been done is comparing failure to not to failure. And not to failure is a very broad term that kind of encapsulates a ton of different, obviously, sub-maximal RARs that you could train with. And so usually the meta-analyses kind of compare those two conditions, and then they ultimately see the outcome that they're observing. Where Martin did a great job of progressing that type of analysis, the kind of the next stage, is he categorized the failure conditions by the variety of different failure definitions that we see within the research. So you have very objective, well-defined definitions like momentary failure, or you have definitions that are considerably less defined, like set failure is the way they kind of classified it in his analysis. So that does a really good job of making that a much more nuanced picture than purely failure versus non-failure. Now, where those analyses are potentially not as apt to look at is the actual shape of the dose response relationship between proximity to failure and the adaptations of interest. And all I mean by that is understanding the entire curve and the exact way that that relationship looks across a different range of RARs. And so that was our goal when we kind of set out to do this analysis, is to paint a picture of the dose response relationship to the best of our ability. Now, like you said, there's been a ton of misinterpretation saying that the two types of analyses are somewhat at odds with one another. I don't view it that way at all. I view them as completely synergistic. As I'll talk about here in a second, we had to go through a lot of subjective liberties to be able to perform the analysis that we did. So the previous analyses were doing the best that they could with the data objectively. We know what the failure definition was. We know the condition was either to failure or not to failure based on the methods of the study. And that's really as granular as you can get from the actual training protocols and the details listed in the studies. So by no means are the analyses at odds with one another. I view them as entirely synergistic. As we'll kind of move to the way that our analyses can probably be best understood, is that essentially what's happening is you're taking the slope of slopes. So that's essentially what's happening. So a slope is just plotting the relationship between RAR and the observed outcome. So in this case, hypertrophy on the study level, and then you're aggregating that across different studies. Obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that with a lot of the statistical techniques that we're utilizing, but that's essentially what's happening is you're taking the relationship on the study level, and then you're ultimately aggregating those to see the overall dose-response relationship after stratifying for a couple different factors that could influence that on a study level as well. And so that on a broad scale is ultimately the difference. And a few other key differences were that our inclusion criteria was really, really broad. We wanted to try to get every study that directly or indirectly manipulates proximity to failure kind of in on this analysis. So we opened up the inclusion criteria considerably more than previous studies had. I think we ended up with a total of 26 studies in the final hypertrophy analysis, which is considerably more than has been done in the past. And again, not right or wrong, just a different inclusion criteria that can lead to a different observed outcome. Now, the biggest thing I want to hit on the front end is what was actually required for us to perform the analysis that we did was a procedure where we went through every single study and via a bunch of different estimation equations using the best available data, kind of logic-based decision-making based on some of the protocols. We had to go through every single study and estimate the RAR value associated with each condition within these studies. And so that's the absolute first thing to state on this project is that that's a subjective process. We try to do our best to make that not only pass kind of face validity checks of like what actually makes sense based on our experience in the gym, but also something that was extremely transparent and well laid out on exactly how we did it using the best available data that we could, so that it was at least understood exactly what we did, and you can ultimately agree or disagree with that process to how we actually obtain the RAR estimation. So that's the very first part of the analysis that's key to understand, is that these estimations could be, biased in either direction a little bit, just due to the subjective nature of how everything was done and some of the assumptions that kind of go into that process. So that's absolute number one to say, is that the whole analysis needs to have this layer of caution associated with it, because we are ultimately assessing and subjectively estimating one of the key variables that went into the analysis. Now that my scientist spiel is off, ultimately I do think it does a pretty good job of doing that, just kind of like practical eye. So I don't think it's completely useless by any means. Obviously, I wouldn't have done the project if I thought that, but it is an important thing to understand when we kind of go into the practical application of understanding the confidence and the ultimately the uncertainty to interpret the results with. So hopefully that kind of gives a broad scale overview of kind of what we did, but if there's any further questions, I'm more than happy to answer them.
Yeah, for sure, man. And several things come to mind. Like you mentioned, there's not a single definition or even so application of what is actually training to failure, right? And that's why I think Martin's work, it's really important to clarify what is failure. And I can even imagine how you approach this. I don't have the understanding for that. How to actually, if a study does not report what was failure, well, how can you know what was it? Did you use, like, let's say, for instance, velocity loss? Did you develop an equation for it? I'd like to dig in a little bit on that one, because that for sure can alone change the ultimate outcome of the meta regressions, right?
100%. So that's a really good question and a really good couple of points. So in the paper we kind of talk about I think it's 6 different buckets that kind of studies could have fell into in terms of the estimating procedure. So to hit on the first thing you said, we did do a sub-analysis that separated two different types of failure definitions. It's a little bit different than the way Martin did his in his analysis. It was a little bit more broad, but we separated it into voluntary and involuntary set termination. So voluntary set termination is volitional failure. Obviously, the zero RAR estimates, so based on the equations, we got a zero RAR, but the failure wasn't really listed in the actual protocol. We consider set termination. Their definition of what they determined the failure conditions were, we considered those as involuntary set termination. So things like, momentary failure fall in that category, concentric failure, the inability to perform a repetition throughout the full range of motion, like anything listed like that, there's a very concrete definition of what they're considering task failure. We can concluded that as involuntary set termination. So that is one of the sub-analyses that we thought was really important to do to see if that altered the way the overall dose-response relationship looked. And spoiler alert, it really didn't. If anything, it kind of strengthens dose response. Not too much of a concern for the overall relationship as far as that one goes. Now, as far as the other estimation procedures, like you said, there's multiple different types of studies that we ultimately had to estimate. The kind of two easiest ones that are off the bat that are pretty easy to estimate is the first case if we had one group training to failure and another group that used the same load but performed a different number of repetitions. It's a simple subtraction problem. 10 reps to failure, 5 reps non-failure, 5 RAR. Very simple in that case. The other pretty simple case is when they actually reported subjective RAR data. That was few and far between. That pretty much never happens. But there was like 2 or 3 studies that directly reported RAR. So we just went ahead and used the RAR data that they actually reported. Then the couple other types of studies that we had were the velocity loss studies that you mentioned. The nice thing about the velocity loss studies is that overall, it's an extremely homogeneous body of literature. They use very similar exercises, very similar loads, very similar populations. The exercise protocols themselves are pretty darn consistent for the most part. So what we did there is we used a set of published equations by the labs that did a lot of this research to estimate the RAR at a given load on a given exercise for a set velocity loss on average. So that was, basically just using the published equations, using a similar load, and the velocity loss, we spit out an estimated RAR. So that was one that was, I feel relatively confident about, given that most of those studies are coming from the labs that actually publish those equations. So I feel relatively good about those. The last two is probably the biggest body of studies are ones where they reported the load that they utilized and the number of reps that they completed. So in these studies, we basically scoured the literature for the best applicable study or couple studies where they looked at the number of repetitions possible at that given load or close to it on that given exercise in a similar population with a similar repetition tempo, for example. And then we ultimately found the maximum possible number of reps in that case minus the actual number of repetitions performed. And then there you get your RAR estimate. So that had, that was probably the most estimation occurring because you're kind of estimating things at a couple different levels. And then finally, the last group of studies were the what I'll call alternative set structure research. And so we have a couple different buckets of studies that fall within there, but ultimately what we did is that we took because these types of set structures, basically where you're introducing interset rest periods for a given number of repetitions. So instead of just performing a set of 10, you might perform 3 reps, rest, 3 reps, rest, 3 reps, rest, and so on. And so what that does is that artificially makes you farther from failure from a given amount of repetitions. And there's been some acute data on this that show that that's pretty profound in terms of maintaining your performance capacity. And so we basically took each one of those mini sets and rated the RAR of that and used that as the RAR estimate. So you hear me talk through all those. Now, I'd be remiss not to bring up some of the limitations with each one of those. That is quite literally the best we could do. And I'm not under the illusion that that's perfect by any means. Even our lab has published data on the ability to perform repetitions at a given percentage of your one round is really, really variable. the sex, exercise, the initial proximity to failure, the rest periods, the loading range that you're utilizing. All of those things can influence the degree of fatigue set to set that you may see, and that's also going to be variable with an individual. So the average RAR estimate that we got for a study may not actually reflect reality because we're using some of these estimation procedures kind of in a static way. Now, additionally, people get stronger throughout studies, right? And sometimes the load progression strategies aren't perfect. So that would, in effect, if I'm keeping the load the same and I'm getting stronger for a given number of repetitions per set, my RAR is actually going to increase over time. So we kind of have these confounding influences that could shake that RAR estimate in kind of either direction. And so ultimately it was our kind of belief that because we kind of have things moving in both directions, hopefully they shake out in kind of a decent middle ground. And like I said, it's quite literally the best we could have done, but I'm not under the illusion by any means that it's perfect. And the only way it will be perfect is in hopefully 50 years, we get a lot better reporting in this area of research to come to some better conclusions ultimately. But yeah, that's kind of how the estimation stuff played out. But I'm not sure if you have any more questions there.
Yeah, totally. It just blows my mind how you measure all these things and how you take it into
Oh,
account. Because from the practical standpoint, so many things like you already alluded, sex, the training status, the exercise selection on itself can really alter the way you perceive what is failure, and also in the practical standpoint again, what an individual understands by failure. Let's say an RAR zero, it's not really momentary muscle failure, right? So all these things taken into consideration, I'd like to ask you, why did you decided to expand upon the inclusion criteria in difference of what Martin did, if this was gonna really complicate things for you as researchers?
yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, ultimately, the kind of the genesis of this project was I was doing my master's thesis on proximity to failure, which has recently been preprinted. And just kind of throughout that process, I was reading all the individual papers and just understanding that non-failure is a really, really non-descriptive way to kind of understand the RER relationship with these adaptations. And honestly, I was most interested in strength. I've talked about hypertrophy more
Yeah.
than anything else, but the kind of the coolest thing to me about the meta regression is there's basically no influence of RER for strength gains, which we don't have to talk about that because I'm sure this is kind of focused on hypertrophy, but that honestly was the genesis of the project that I wanted to do, to even just remotely explore the dose response relationships between both of these adaptations. And so from my perspective, I think the inclusion criteria for the meta regression, I just wanted to be as broad as possible because we have all of these different areas that directly or indirectly manipulate proximity to failure. And I think just ignoring them potentially doesn't give you the best scope on all of the different things that could influence it. There's obviously some heterogeneity that's introduced in doing it that way. But for my kind of the way that I wanted to approach this project, I think casting as wide of a net as we did is a strength of this project. But one could argue that by isolating the inclusion criteria a bit more to certain studies that are a little bit more homogeneous and don't introduce some of these extraneous confounders. Just as an example, some people potentially wouldn't want to include cluster set studies. So cluster set studies, they are going to change the proximity to failure by introducing the interset rest interval, so breaking up a given number of repetitions, but typically they also increase the total number, total rest that you're getting. So that's an additional confounder in those studies in the sense that, okay, proximity to failure isn't equated, but rest also isn't equated. So that's another kind of confounding influence that a totally reasonable researcher or individual could say, I don't know if I want to group all these studies together. But in my opinion, the way that we approach this project and the exploratory nature of it, I think casting a really wide net, trying to include as many studies as possible, and then trying to stratify by a bunch of these different variables was going to be our best approach. And that's kind of just the way that I wanted to approach it. So I don't really have a good answer other than that's what I thought was the best thing to do. And there's definitely valid arguments against that. So I'm not saying it's the only way to go about it, but I just wanted to cast a really wide net, try to get all the studies I was aware of into this thing and kind of see what we found.
Yeah, I find it super funny because most of the people that I've had the privilege to talk to, like yourself in the research field, some of the answers are like, well, I thought it was cool, you know, and us, I kind of, I don't know, overthink about why they did it this way or whatever. And your answer, it's to me the coolest stuff. Well, I thought it was cool. I wanted to know, you know.
Yep.
So I find that pretty cool. But no, my man, I actually do want to dig into the strength results, both the strength and
Cool.
hypertrophy outcomes, because I actually downloaded and read your let me tell your modern guide to RPE and REI for
Awesome.
both strength and hypertrophy. And I found it really interesting because I was thinking prior to reading this and your research in the threshold model that you mentioned in your guide, and the way that you proposed your model going from 10 RAR to 0 RAR, that can be effective in the right context. That's what I wanted to dig in a little bit, using a little bit of the results that you find in your meta regressions.
Sure.
Do you think it's cool if we begin by strength, your outcomes, and how to apply it in our training?
100%. That's awesome. I'm excited to talk about this guy. I'm going to talk about it a lot. So
Oh, my man.
I appreciate it.
Please go ahead, man.
So yeah, I guess we can kind of talk about I would say the modern perception of kind of RAR, and kind of both adaptations and just kind of the way that it's viewed. So for the most part, I think people have the inherent understanding that you have to train hard to get good results. And that's obviously a well-placed kind of intuition, right? But ultimately, I would say the simplest way to say what our results ultimately suggest is that what training hard means for each of these adaptations is different. That's really what it comes down to. For strength, grinding out a bunch of sets where you've accumulated a bunch of fatigue within a set probably doesn't augment your strength outcomes in the short to moderate term. And so that's the first thing I want to hammer on, is that obviously the duration of the training studies that we have in the literature is not a super long time frame, right? I'm not going to take the results from this meta-analysis and say that's how you should train all the time for the next 5 years. For strength particularly, under the assumption that muscle size is going to be probably the biggest predictor of your strength in the long run, you can see how the case for some sort of periodization, you can do it without a periodized approach, but that's kind of made, is that in the short to moderate term, we could do this type of training, and then in the longer term, we might want to go towards more some of the hypertrophy results that we'll talk about in a second. So what I'm talking about when I talk about strength is more in that short to moderate term. Maybe, okay, I want to express my strength potential now in the next 6 to 16 weeks, something like that. So with that in mind, we have to train hard to have the best kind of outcomes in either strength or hypertrophy. For strength, though, the way that it's typically kind of viewed is, I think people think about, okay, I want to train low repetition sets, and then I want to make those really, really challenging. Now, that, particularly the case of like a set of 5 with like 1 rep in the tank, that's kind of the example I usually think in my head. So that's a pretty low repetition set, really close to failure. That set is really challenging predominantly because you're accumulating a lot of fatigue within that set. Based on our results, once you've taken the percentage of 1RM kind of out of the equation, and we've decided we're going to use 80% of our 1RM, accumulating more fatigue within a set really doesn't seem to influence strength outcomes really at all. If anything, going to failure might be a little bit deleterious, which makes sense for anybody who's kind of trained for 1RM strength. And so what that really leads us to is that training for strength predominantly should be challenging because the bar is really, really heavy. So you can have a repetition be close to failure for 2 different reasons. One was because I'm adding a ton of load to the bar, and for a single repetition, my RPE is rising, my RAR is decreasing because it's really, really close to 100% of my 1RM. So that single is getting closer to failure, but it's because I'm adding load. Whereas in the case of taking 80% of my 1RM and accumulating a bunch of repetitions within the set, in that case, I'm getting closer to failure because my intraset fatigue is accumulating. Those are 2 different reasons. And so for strength, it seems to be the former case that is much more advantageous. And so if you just think about the way that a 1RM, what physiological quality is that ultimately assessing, in my opinion, the thing that seems to make the most sense from just like a logical mental model perspective is that it's an assessment of maximal force production measured in a specific context. So a 1RM squat or 1RM bench press, whatever it is, you're basically assessing your maximal force production expressed in that test. And so from a principle of specificity perspective, actually the first rep in every one of those sets is going to be the highest force production that you're going to perform. And so it seems that ultimately that the load is going to dictate the outcomes that you're probably going to see. And then accumulating more intraset fatigue within that set really doesn't seem to influence outcomes much at all. And then if I'm putting my practitioner's hat on, I know that those sets come with quite a bit more fatigue. So why would I really waste my recovery resources on those sets if I can use that to recover from heavier and heavier loads throughout the week, right? So if I'm looking to improve my squat training, I would think it's probably a better way to use your kind of fatigue budget to distribute really heavy exposures to really close to your 1RM loads multiple times throughout the week, rather than accumulating a bunch of sets with a bunch of fatigue within those sets, because everybody has a limited fatigue budget, and training hard in some capacity is going to pull on that fatigue budget. And it seems like the variable that's going to be the highest leverage for 1RM strength is going to be the load rather than accumulating intraset fatigue. And you've talked about the velocity loss studies. That's a really good kind of conceptual model for it as well, is that for strength, you're basically trying to keep velocity loss pretty minimal, as much as logistically feasible, basically. And then, you know, somewhere under a 20% velocity loss threshold probably doesn't have deleterious effects. And so that can kind of be the way you can prioritize. The reason that training is hard for strength is more so that it's heavy rather than you're really, really tired or really, really fatigued. Now, for hypertrophy, it's basically the exact opposite, is that for hypertrophy, load really doesn't seem to matter at all. We have really good data on the fact that so long as sets are taken to the point of failure or very close to it, basically 30 to 90% of 1RM can all be effective hypertrophy promoting loads, right? So load, throw that out the window, it really doesn't seem to matter. So the thing that seems to drive hypertrophy adaptations for the most part, obviously volume and things like this will also play a role, but within a set, is the distance from failure that set is ultimately terminated. And so those are where, to me, that's the really practical nugget of the results that we found, is that the conceptual models of how proximity to failure influences these different adaptations is different, such that what training hard means for strength and what it means for hypertrophy are very different, and probably should prioritize one versus the other in the event that you want to maximize one adaptation kind of versus the other. So I think that's from a 1,000-foot view, to me, that's the practical perspective. And you can notice from that, I'm not saying you should take every set to failure. I'm not saying you should take every set to 2 RIR. That is all based on a coach's eye and the actual, you know, interacting factors of all these different things that you're going to put down on a piece of paper, right? The exercise selection, the total volume someone's using. This person has a chronic autoimmune condition that doesn't allow them to recover normally compared to someone else. All those actual practical application pieces are left to coaches that know the actual athlete and lifter that they're dealing with to apply these ideas on an individual level in whatever makes the most sense. The goal that we sought out to understand is just kind of that textbook understanding of, on average, what's the directional relationship of these physiological dose response curves. Now, the curve could, you know, this is an interesting kind of discussion too. Now that we've been able to revise the preprint that was initially printed, we actually have a second version posted, and that was a really interesting kind of process to receive feedback, see how people interpret it. And I thought Dr. Helms did a really good job kind of talking about the utility of preprints on the last episode that you guys did. And I think that's a really important thing. I have a lot to say about that as well, but ultimately the feedback that we got on that first version was really, really useful. And I think people were potentially over extrapolating the way exactly that the first curve in the first version looked. Ultimately, the way that I see it is that, okay, changes in muscle size tend to improve as we get closer to failure. And that's ultimately where I'm going to stop with my confident conclusions. As we've kind of went through this, we talked about the estimation procedure. There's a whole bunch of statistical jargon I could get into in terms of little subjective things that go into fitting statistical models that can influence the way that that line bends just a little bit. We try to do our best to have a really shotgun approach to fitting different dose response models. But even within that, there are little subjectivities that can ultimately influence the way that ultimately that curve looks on the end. And I think the key thing to understand for the audience is that the way that that curve looks is really, really non-stable. the differences between the linear model that is in this most up-to-date version and the kind of the nonlinear model that was posted in the first version is razor thin. And that's just because only 26 studies, not a ton of outcomes within those studies, and the spread of the data doesn't make the overall fits of these models super, super strong. They're modest at best. It's quite literally the best we could do, but it's not exactly how the dose response relationship works. I think people have been kind of like comparing the effect sizes really, really granularly and saying you're going to get this much more muscle growth if you go to failure. I don't think that's a good way to interpret this ultimately. I purely view it as what is the directionality of these relationships to which a coach, knowing the exact specific context in which they're applying these kind of principles is the way that I view them. They can decide whether that's justifiable or not, given the exact case. So hopefully that gives kind of a good overview of the results and how we can ultimately turn that into practical application when applying that to a program. But that's kind of the 50,000-foot view that I think is kind of important to chew on and understand and realize it's a pretty uncertain statement, kind of given all things, right? It's just that, hey, it seems that going closer to failure can benefit us to some capacity, although the exact degree to which that's the case is still pretty uncertain. And I would definitely wait for more really well-controlled individual studies that do a really good job of reporting and controlling. And once we've accumulated a bunch of those over the next 20 years, maybe we can run this type of analysis again and be a lot more confident when all these subjectivities in the estimation procedure for each one of these studies doesn't have to be the predominant part of the analysis, if that makes sense.
Man, a lot to tackle, and I love it, by the way. One of the way you start your paper, it's by talking about how training to failure has been categorized as either, like you mentioned earlier in the conversation, to failure or not failure. Which in reality, proximity to failure, it's a continuous variable that can be applied on the very same manner and making use of your guide. I love the part that you mentioned that specificity is multifactorial and how with, let's say, lower RPEs, this thing confuses me sometimes. You get higher force production, and when you go closer to failure, you get practice with the movement variability. So what does that mean? For me, at least, it means that I don't need to think about being 0 to 4 reps in reserve. I can think about the nature of what I'm trying to train, the nature of what I'm trying to adapt, really. And based on that, that's what I love the most. The application can be so simple as maybe just a top set back off, and there you go. You applied all this complexity, and that's what I try to, at least for me, make it clear so I can, before I can prescribe this to a client or for me even. So I like to dig a little bit in how to actually apply this, and if maybe your research has changed the way you view things particularly.
Yeah, no, and that's a great question. It's easy to stay in the comfort of theoretical models and not actually have to say, hey, here's how I'd recommend going to apply it. But ultimately, when somebody's looking to do something in the gym, they need to understand how to actually take the ideas and write it down on their program when they head into train on Monday, right? So ultimately, I guess, like I said, we can kind of break this up into strength and hypertrophy again. And so the first thing you mentioned is I definitely want to hammer home what you said about strength in the specificity of proximity to failure is multifactorial. I definitely don't want someone to take away from this of saying, okay, so taking a set close to failure for strength has absolutely zero utility. I don't think that's the case at all. I think that you can isolate the benefits of being closer to failure in a specific context maybe better in a different way than just taking, a set of 8 to failure for strength. I think that those benefits that you get closer to failure, like experiencing what it feels like to have slow repetition velocity, experiencing what it feels like for the loading demands to shift, your hips to shift back on a squat and realize that it's not completely now in your quads. All those little things that we understand as lifters that happen as we get closer to failure. I think you can isolate those things to be specific to the demands that we're actually trying to train for, which is a 1RM in a better way. And so, but if you're time limited, let's say, taking a set of 5 or 6 or 7 reps, like pretty close to the house, that's going to be really, really efficient from a time perspective to still kind of make some pretty good grounds towards hypertrophy, still deliver a pretty meaningful strength stimulus, but maybe just be a little bit less optimal for either one of the adaptations, if that makes sense. But it's still a really, really good approach for kind of a generalist. But okay, with that caveat out of the way, for strength, the kind of the starting point that I would have from a practical perspective is that first the question is, okay, what does strength mean to me? What is the context in which I'm testing that? Typically, you know, when I talk about this, I'm thinking of kind of a powerlifting application or just a 1RM on a given movement is kind of what I think of when I think of strength. And so ultimately, to me, kind of the best way to apply these ideas is that we want to, because load in percentage of 1RM seems to be by far the most predictive factor of strength gains, we want to try to accumulate basically as much load under the curve throughout a week as we can recover from. And so that's not to say load is the only factor that matters. Obviously, we have other factors that matter: frequency, volume, proximity to failure to some degree. But as kind of my baseline, that's kind of how I'm trying to set up training, is I'm trying to accumulate the most load I possibly can under the week. Now, for anyone who's ever tried to, you know, run any sort of daily max program or anything like that, where you're taking this principle to the absolute brink of feasibility, that's pretty challenging to do, even mentally, to recover from, etc. So from my experience as a coach, I don't think that the absolute logical extension of load being the most predictive factor from strength gains is really practical or feasible. So, okay, we have some degree of very, very heavy load training that we're going to do. Maybe that's a single, anywhere from 1 to 3 times a week. Could be more from that. I've had, you know, lifters on bench press do singles even up to 6 times a week. It can really depend on the individual context, but we're going to have some degree of really heavy load training that is the absolute most force production that we can train in a given set. You know, the closer we get that single to our percentage of 1RM, that's going to be the most specific training that we can do and theoretically have the best carryover. But from there, we probably want to accumulate some more volume, whether that be for practice reasons, whether that be for some of these other neuromuscular adaptations like rate of force development or other things like that. And even the morphological adaptations like muscle size, things like that, that probably play a role for strength in the moderate to long term. So there's other reasons we'd want to accumulate training volume, right? So eventually you're going to have to pick a secondary load, which, like you already referred to, is kind of the way that I do it, is top set in some sort of back off percentage. There's obviously other ways to do it, but I think that's kind of the simplest way to kind of communicate it from an application perspective, is once you've decided what that back off percentage load is going to be based on the exercise, your individual tolerances, what you seem to, you know, progress with in terms of strength, then the principle there from our findings is, okay, once I kind of know my load and maybe the total number of repetitions that I want to accumulate, I would probably err on the side of making sure each one of those individual sets is decently far from failure from relative to what's possible, than performing a ton of those sets very closer to failure. Is really as simple as it gets. So I'm going to come into the gym, I'm going to perform some sort of top set that's going to be focused on trying to make that a pretty heavy load. Let's say a single at 95% of my 1RM. Then I'm going to drop that load back, maybe somewhere in the 70 to 85% of 1RM range. Let's call it 80%. And then I have 16 repetitions that I need to complete with 80% of 1RM. One approach is I'm going to perform 2 sets of 8. Both of those are at 0 to 1 RIR. The alternate approach is I'm going to perform 8 sets of 2, and all of those are going to be 6 reps from failure. Based on my, you know, combination of our results and my practical experience of kind of what we're trying to do here, I would favor the latter scenario, in the sense that we are providing a relatively equivalent strength stimulus because the load is equated in both of those scenarios, but we're minimizing substantially the fatigue associated with that workload that will affect our next kind of really heavy top set coming later in the week. And so as a principle for strength, that was basically how I would view it, is that when possible for that kind of volume work, probably err that on the side of farther from failure at a given load than closer to failure. And that's mostly because that probably is going to have a negative influence on those really, really important top sets that are going to really mimic the 1RM that you're trying to train for later in the week. Now, for hypertrophy, again, basically the exact opposite, right? Now, this one's where it gets a little bit more challenging, because there are a few interacting factors that make the exact prescription that I would use personally different, right? So one of the interacting factors that probably influences the necessary proximity to failure to optimize muscle growth on a per set basis is the load you're using. If I'm training with really, really heavy loads, like let's say 85% of my 1RM, which is somewhere around a 6 rep max or so, I probably don't need to go to failure to maximize the hypertrophy stimulus of those loads. I can probably stay 1-2 reps shy, and I'm probably totally fine there. And that's just because the neuromuscular kind of processes that are going to lead to tension being applied to that muscle are already pretty close to maximal with those types of loads. Whereas if I'm training with maybe 30% of my 1RM, trying some of these lower load training protocols, it may be a little bit more important to go very close to failure in those cases. That's, one of the first examples where that's kind of important to understand for the exact practical application. So just to nail that home, if I'm training with heavy loads, you don't need to be quite as close to failure than training with lighter loads, probably. And an area where I think it's important to realize that kind of intersects in a practical place, in our analysis, we didn't find an effect of multi-joint versus single joint exercises. But I think from a practical perspective, people really seem to have a strong sense there that multi-joint exercises don't need to, or maybe shouldn't, go quite as close to failure. And the reason I think people think that is because purely based on logistics of the implements that you would use for multi-joint exercises, I think people typically tend to train with heavier loads. So if I'm training a squat, I'm probably not using that to do my sets of 30 rep max, right? I'm probably more so navigating towards the sets of 8, the sets of 6, the things like that, which is going to kind of overlap, just from a logistical perspective, load and exercise selection. So it's probably not the exercise selection per se, but probably the fact that those two variables are really tightly linked from a practical perspective. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind. But okay, when I'm designing a program, ultimately, what are the RIRs that I should choose? The way that I view it is that, again, the stock standard principle is that we probably want to be as close to failure as we can kind of logistically tolerate, and that doesn't have a ton of negative downstream implications. And so that's pretty broad, right? And what do I mean by that? To me, I take this kind of on an exercise by exercise basis for a given individual. So if I have a squat, let's say, and I take 3 sets to failure, that is going to completely wreck my performance, probably, for the rest of those sets and maybe the rest of my session. So in that case, that juice probably isn't worth the squeeze, because I'm negatively influencing my performance and even my perception of effort to be able to get to task failure or very close to it on my remaining exercises. Anyone that's ever done, a moderate rep set of squats to failure, your ability to train hard is definitely impacted on those other exercises. You may get to that last bicep curl and say, that's probably a failure, when in reality, you probably could have kept pushing a little bit more. So I think that's a non-negligible factor. And so ultimately, that's kind of how I think about it, is on an individual and exercise and, programming basis, what is the closest to failure that we can train without a ton of downstream implications? And so, for certain exercises for me, I can take pretty much every set to failure and be fine. I'm thinking of some of my back movements, things like that. I don't tend to have a ton of performance drop off when I take those really close to or all the way to failure, even for moderate to high volumes. But for multi-joint lower body exercises, that's definitely not the case for me. So in that case, I'm going to manipulate my proximity to failure to try to basically get as close as I can, while still allowing for near maximal or really high performance on my other sets. So as kind of a stock standard approach, I think, going to, 2 to 3 RIR in the first set and kind of declining that down to 0 or 1 RIR in the last set, I think that makes a ton of sense. Pretty trenches tested too, I would say, is kind of taking that last set to failure. I think there's a lot of logistical benefits from doing that too, is just kind of always keeping a pulse on the accuracy of your RIR. I think that's a nice logistical benefit of kind of taking that last set to failure as well. But by no means is that the only way to organize things. And I don't think that should ever be a takeaway of our results. It's just that here are kind of the general effects and the directionality of this relationship. But within that, I could do an additional set or two of training 3 reps in reserve and potentially equalize the outcomes. And for in a given individual, given exercise, like I said, that may be a worthwhile trade-off in comparison to something else. On the other hand, somebody may really, really like training to failure, and that's an absolute crucial part of their training adherence. Then maybe we got to manipulate some other variables to make that work. So ultimately, I view this as many roads lead to Rome, and it's not a necessary variable to be a certain way to actually result in progress. There's a lot of RARs that can lead to progress, like you said. Is that threshold model kind of means it has to be in this range for it to work? I don't really think that necessarily applies. It's just that based on the RAR that you find to be the best for your logistics and kind of the exact case that you're applying it, we may need to flip around the other variables to make that make sense.
Yeah, totally, man. I think one of the important key takeaways, or maybe we can make use of another study that recently came out. It's the one with the 52 sets. I don't recall the researcher, but I'm sure you know which study. The thing that I learned from that one is that we need to first take into account the role, or better said, the interplay between volume and intensity, and that we adapt from during that period to set volume. We can get better with set volume with proximities to failure, and not think about it. Oh, okay, you have this program, and and it says RAR2, RAR0. Oh, it's wrong because it needs to be here and there, right? For me, that's the key takeaway. Take into account, okay, this is the individual level, because one of the other important things, like we mentioned yesterday with Dr. Helms, is that the results of a study, RCTs, we talk about a group level, but of course we usually have outliers that perhaps respond like yourself all to failure, which is, it might not be my case, and take that into account, and the interplay between variables, not think about failure and not failure in a vacuum, right?
100%. And I think I after this came out, I've been posed as like a pro failure guy for hypertrophy, which I think is kind of funny. That guide is kind of says the opposite. I think initially when I was reading kind of individual studies, I was more so about kind of bringing options back on the table that potentially allow for certain conditions where training further from failure can still optimize hypertrophy. So it's funny to me that I've been posed as kind of the pro failure guy after all this stuff has kind of got out there. But ultimately, the premise that I have changed my mind on, and I think is important for people to actually see evidence of in the case of the individual, is just that failure is de facto more fatiguing. That's ultimately the one thing that I've changed my mind on. I think the actual evidence for long-term fatigue of a given proximity to failure is honestly really weak. And if we look at that data in the same epistemic way that we would any other body of research, for example, caffeine had very few longitudinal training studies for a really long time. I think there's 1 or 2 now. But there was always that, okay, here's what the acute data for performance and caffeine say, but we don't have any long-term data, so we really can't say much. That same exact thing has never been said about the acute data for proximity to failure fatigue. It's always been that, failure is disproportionately more fatiguing. And I've said this stuff too, so I'm not taking the blame away. Like I definitely have tried to be, right my wrongs on this topic, but for whatever reason, this topic has not been talked about in the same way. And we have, to my knowledge, there's 3 studies that even remotely look at longitudinal adaptations to proximity to failure fatigue, and they all seem to say we adapt a little bit. So I think it's a really good point that you bring up, is that RAR prescriptions aren't static. You can adapt to them, you can progress them, you can do all of these things that can allow somebody to tolerate a given proximity to failure potentially better. And that if we can agree there's a potential benefit of training closer to failure, to me, from a coaching perspective, I at least want to see evidence that that is a problem on the individual level. So the example that I would bring up is like, if somebody their performance is tanking, they're reporting, negative associations with training, joint aches and pains and niggles and things like that. That's evidence of saying, okay, maybe the fatigue trade-off isn't worth it in this case. And that could happen a lot. But alternatively, I've seen a couple scenarios where people that are really resistant to fatigue, typically need really high set volumes and things like that, where maybe if we were to pull on this proximity to failure lever a little bit more because they're not showing us evidence that they can't handle it, then maybe we're able to bring down total training time and things like that a little bit more. So I view this on an exercise by exercise basis and within an individual, and kind of looking for evidence to show me where that kind of stimulus to fatigue ratio kind of breaks for that individual. And so just understanding the directionality of that relationship can kind of guide your troubleshooting, right? And that's really what we sought out to do is if we expect that there's a little bit of stimulus to be gained as we get closer to failure, we can pull on that lever given the other parts of the training variables are sufficient, right? If someone is totally tolerating the training completely fine and they maybe are not seeing the rate of progress that we would expect, maybe we can pull on that lever a little bit more, and it's not a completely not okay thing that we're taking a lot of sets to failure if they're tolerating it totally. So that's really the biggest thing from a practical application thing that I'm trying to get across, is that I think that, okay, we have this relationship that we understand. We have the, in the trenches experience to say that training hard is a pretty important variable for getting, muscle growth and hypertrophy. Okay, so on the individual level, I'm trying to understand the trade-off between the potential additional stimulus and the potential fatigue associated with that. But I want to confirm that. I don't just want to accept the fact that, okay, failure is definitely more fatiguing, so we're going to train at 2 RAR, and that's where we got to stay because that's going to be too much. I would just want to challenge that and say that very well could be the case, and it could even happen, at 3 reps in reserve. Maybe going to 2 reps in reserve is too much for somebody on certain exercises, but confirming that that's the case and actually observing that in the client, I think is kind of an important layer of practical application.
Yeah, because in the, let's say, evidence-based community, between quotes, we can go between camps. Like, for instance, if we follow Dr. Pack and we train with the minimum dosage, it's a way to train, right? And you
How
need to
much is he
train like
paying?
that because sadly he's not paying me yet, so hopefully we can work something out, man. And then if we go with the 52 set studies, but you need to do 52 sets, man, because you have this study. And if we look at your research, you need to go closer and closer to failure. But if we go to another, and that's not the way that we really need to understand about these things. We need to understand about methods, the limitations, for instance, in meta regressions, in meta-analysis. And also, I think the most difficult part for me, at least, is developing critical thinking to be able to make these decisions on the go and be okay with it. Like, let's say you program RER 0 for an individual in a back squat. Maybe in that particular context, in that scenario, that's perfectly fine, and it's going to be a positive way to adapt. But for maybe other individual, it's not going to be the case. And I think that's the most difficult thing, not only for me, but for a lot of people to really understand and take a grasp of it. So that's why I love having these conversations, because it challenged my own beliefs. Like that, the last thing you mentioned about failure and fatigue, because for me that was the case. That okay, it's okay if you want to train failure, but that's gonna get more fatiguing and so on and so forth. But where does that come from? Where did I read that from, and how sure am I of that statement, right?
Yeah, and it's one of those things that, like, I don't want to dismiss like my experience with it either. But the thing that I think, I always say this when this topic comes up, is like when the topic of proximity to failure and fatigue come up, I think every single person that hears that conversation immediately goes to squats, leg press, or hack squat in their mind. That is the only exercise that people think of it, and they say, well, okay, no, failure is definitely more fatiguing. Because I'm thinking of a hack squat and a set of 15 on a hack squat, and that's going to leave me on the floor for 3 minutes. In that context, it very well may be not worth the trade-off, and that's totally fine. I'm in agreement with that. But in the 95% of other training contexts, there may be perfectly reasonable applications of it, right? Like, again, just for me, I have tested it multiple times, even for like a moderate to high set volume within a session. Certain back exercises I can take to failure, or even like lengthen partial failure, and I can maintain my performance pretty well. I'll have a rep drop off or two, but the thing I'm looking for is that decline in performance dramatically different than if I was to keep a rep or two or 3 in the tank, right? And for me, in those specific contexts, it doesn't really seem to be a huge trade-off. And just, you know, obviously anecdotally, my progress in my pulling muscles has seemed to progress substantially once I started training kind of with, okay, I want to prove to myself that it's excessive fatigue, right? And that has seemingly benefited my progress substantially. So that's kind of the way that I view the process, is just don't take anything at just 100% face value in terms of those statements. You just want to see confirmed evidence. And some of those stereotypes are stereotypes for a reason, right? Like, okay, it is in going into someone doing 3 sets of squats for 15 reps and taking those to 0 RER, actual failure where they drop it on the pins. Am I assuming that that's probably not the best way to go about it? Yes, absolutely. My experience suggests that as well. So all of these different situations, I have a suspicion where it's going to be applicable and where it's not, but I don't think that you should just automatically assume that there's a 100% chance this is going to be the case, and I don't even need to explore it. And so the reason I say this is I think we can explore some of these other variables too to make that fatigue cost substantially less, like rest intervals, the repetition range that you're training with. All of those things can kind of change the amount of fatigue that we probably will expect. And the other thing I always like to bring back is like I talked about already, the loads that you're typically using for your multi-joint exercises are typically the loads where you don't need to go that close to failure either. So that's almost the worst case to kind of think of fatigue and failure in my mind, because that's not even required theoretically to maximize the stimulus, or it's going to be negligible, the amount of benefit that you get. So in that case, it's probably not totally worth it. So that's just my rant on fatigue, and just kind of thinking that through a little bit. But yeah, there's a lot of more work to do as far as that stuff goes as well. Like I said, there's only like 3 longitudinal studies on fatigue that I'm aware of, and it very well may be that as we get more ecologically valid training interventions where they're training all muscle groups of the body, moderate to high set volumes, things like that, maybe the fatigue kind of argument kind of changes a little bit, because obviously we've only had training interventions where they're training 1 or 2 muscle groups. The total set volume isn't going to reflect what people do in the real world, and there's a lot of differences where that kind of stuff kind of can change the results you may see in kind of the real world. But I think you're still safe with the principle of like, okay, you can come in with your kind of your practical hat and perception of how is going to best work on the individual level here. And for a multi-joint exercise, maybe I'm going 4, 3, 2, 1 RER, or maybe even staying above 2 RER for those multi-joint exercises. But if that client seems to be tolerating that totally fine, and you reach a plateau, maybe you can inch that a little bit closer, right? Like it's a perfectly reasonable kind of lever to pull on if the scenario ultimately leads you to thinking that's a good option, right?
Yeah, totally, man. And just to be super respectful of your time, well, I think we're not gonna get like recipe from studies from scientific research. We get guides, we get a specific context, then we can decide if it applies to us or for clients, and think about it that way, with limitations, with strengths, and the very nature of the study we're looking at, whether it's an RCT, it's a meta-analysis, a meta-regression, whatever it is. And that's, I think, the more than the results of the study in itself, how at least can better understand what I'm reading, what I'm talking about. Because if not, like we alluded, we can go to either camps. And something that you mentioned that I find funny, and I don't help at all with that, is that you in the research field tend to get categorized. For instance, you are the failure guy. For instance, Dr. Pike is the minimum. But for instance, I had the conversation with Max Coleman about deloads. He's the deload guy, and it's
100%.
kind of funny because that's not the case, right? because and like I mentioned, I don't help at all because I asked you about your research and stuff. So I'm sorry about that, man. It's not intentional.
No, you're good.
The last thing I wanted to ask you, to again be respectful of your time, it's that you already alluded to it, but what do you think for yourself at least are the future lines of research that you like to see, to find out, to work on?
Yeah, so I think Martin is going to spearhead this. He's been working on his kind of dissertation data collection for his kind of big project for his PhD. I think that's going to set the standard, kind of how proximity to failure should be reported, controlled, and ultimately set up to actually investigate that variable in an appropriate way. So I think he's gonna carry the torch of kind of the training interventions and how that ultimately should be set up. Recently, just put out my master's thesis, which we tried to do the best we could. There's some limitations associated with that, particularly with hypertrophy. Unfortunately, that basically make those results pretty limited. It's a pretty solid strength study once again, but for hypertrophy, it's pretty limited. So those are a couple examples of like how I hope that training studies will kind of be designed moving forward. And honestly, it'd be a massive step forward if in every single training study that we see, kind of the descriptive table of the training intervention, that there's an RIR kind of column in that training table, right? That's really what we need, is that we just need people to treat that as a primary resistance training variable, because it's so important for a lot of these adaptations, that understanding where those studies kind of stack up when we read a training intervention is going to help us with future kind of meta-analytic projects, or just being able to classify those training interventions and understand how that variable works. So the main thing that just needs to continue to improve is just more well done training studies that report, control, and ultimately report, control. I mean, I'm missing one every time I talk about this. There's one more, but report, control, and keep in mind the RAR that they're ultimately trying to study. So there's a lot of different ways you can do that with study designs, whether that's using velocity, whether that's relying on subjective RAR. There's a ton of different kind of nuances you could go into with study design, but ultimately we just need better training studies that ultimately actually report the outcome that we're interested in. So 50 years down the line, when we want to kind of try to redo this project with a lot higher quality data, that we can do this with a lot more confidence, because the individual studies are actually taking notes and being aware of the proximity to failure in which people are reporting. So yeah, it's an area that is really important, and over time I think people will become more aware of kind of how to keep that in mind when they're designing studies and reporting the descriptives of the training intervention, even if that's not the primary question. And I think that'll kind of benefit everything overall, just because it's like not controlling the percentage of 1RM that people are training at. If that's just something you're not even aware of, that can be a limitation in a lot of different studies that ultimately will just benefit resistance training research overall. So hopefully we see those changes as we kind of move forward. And I know multiple people in the field that are kind of, working on different projects. We got a couple projects working on in our lab as well. One of them kind of looking at the interplay between RAR and volume, which has obviously been a next kind of implication from this project and some of the other volume research that you mentioned. So that's one we're excited about. But yeah, it's just we just need more data. As always, the infamous more research is needed, right? So the unfortunate last line of this podcast. I also should probably just say it depends, because that's it's got to get all the buzzwords out there. So yeah, man.
Yeah, when in doubt, it depends, or either we need more research.
Yeah. Mic drop.
Yeah, man. When I'm teaching a class and I really don't know the answer, I go like into deep thought. Well, maybe it depends from, you make something up and you finish with, but we need more research.
For sure. There you go. You can say anything you want. Anything you want.
But I promise not to, man, because I try to keep it as evidence-based as possible. My man, Zac, I just want to thank you. Thank you again for taking the time. It's been, at least for me, super insightful. I'll be sure to leave this in my profile, and then I upload it, if you allow me, to YouTube, so people can watch it whenever they want to, and leave it as a free resource for everybody. And I hope we can do this again sometime. And for sure, I'll be on the lookout for your research, for the things you post, and for data-driven strength. So, my man, just to thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you, man. Seriously, I appreciate it. You do a great job communicating things, and again, you're doing valuable work, and I appreciate it. And I also appreciate hearing your feedback on what we do. So, yeah, honestly, I'm the thankful one. I appreciate it, and grateful for the opportunity to kind of share what we did.
My pleasure, man. So I hope you have a great rest of the day, and talk to you soon, I hope.